Hello and welcome to today's ASUM Group webinar on managing unstructured data to ensure regulatory compliance and add value. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at ASUM Group and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are David Wright, Chief Data Officer, Data and Analytics Solutions at BNY Mellon, Joe Byrne, Privacy Solutions Engineer at OneTrust, Mark Evans, Senior Sales Engineer at ActiveNav, Daniel Roberts, Solutions Engineering Director at MarkLogic, and Dale Richards, Board and Strategy Advisor, FinTech and Data. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first just a little bit of info for you to get the most out of the webinar. To the right of your video screen, you'll see two panels, one for polls and one for questions. We'll be running 3 polls in today's webinar, so please do have a look in that channel where you will be able to see the questions and make your votes. Great if you would take part so that we can get some indication of what you're thinking on the questions that are being asked. Also in the question panel, you can put questions for our expert speakers there. We'll take as many as we can throughout the webinar. We won't save them till the end, so please put them up as often and as frequently as you want to. So thank you very much indeed, and over to our speakers. And David, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your involvement in unstructured data.
Thank you, Sarah. Great to be here. I'm glad to have the conversation with all my colleagues on unstructured data and its role in our current environment. So my name is David Wright, as Sarah mentioned, and I am the Chief Data Officer within Data and Analytics Solutions at BNY Mellon. And what Data and Analytics Solutions does as an entity of BNY Mellon is provide platforms and services in order to enable our buy-side clients to be able to manage their investments better. And my role and job within that is to assure we have all of the right data brought together to enable our clients to make those decisions that they need. And with the evolution and evolving use of both structured and unstructured data in the marketplace, the more valuable it becomes in terms of assessing all of those different opportunities and being able to drive business value by curating those and giving the enablement capabilities to our clients.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Joe.
Oh, hi. Yes, thanks, Sarah. I'm Joseph Byrne, Principal Solutions Engineer at OneTrust, and my day-to-day role is to describe to people how OneTrust works and the value it can bring to their business. I have a bit of a history with unstructured data from my SharePoint days. So prior to working in privacy, I worked for several SharePoint consultancies, and we'd install SharePoint and point it at their unstructured data, which would index it, and suddenly it was all findable, which was always a fun exercise to see what would turn up, both positive and sometimes concerning, you could say. So yeah, great to be here, part of this discussion today.
Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome everyone. And yeah, my name is Mark Evans. I'm the Director of Sales Engineering here at ActiveNav. And just like Joseph, I work with our prospects and clients and help them understand how they can implement technology into their organization to help them get a better handle of their unstructured data, to be able to, first of all, understand what it is, the extent of it, and put in mechanisms, policies, and practices to help manage that and protect that content over time. Been with ActiveNav for 3 years, and prior to that, had a long career in information management and governance across the full life cycle. So pleasure to be with you all, and looking forward to an engaging conversation today.
Thank you. And coming to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Sarah. My name is Daniel Roberts. I'm Director of Solution Engineering for Financial Services in APAC and also EMEA. We at MarkLogic spend our lives managing and dealing with complex data and helping our clients to extract value from that complex data, whether that's semi-structured, structured, or unstructured data. And of course, in financial services, there's a lot of all of those types. So yeah, thanks very much for the invite. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. And over to you, Dale.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks a lot for inviting me today. It's exciting to participate with a great group of panelists. My involvement has traditionally been on the sell side of this equation, working with vendors and solution providers in the space. I'm from, I guess, most recently, the alternative data world as a board member of Quandl, a board member of Eagle Alpha, where they're sussing out all kinds of interesting data that's typically unstructured for use in decision-making and analysis. I'm also a board member of a company called Cezanne out of Paris that is an NLP firm that extracts information for unstructured information for decision support, and all kinds of analytics for PE firms, et cetera. I have a history in the space. I was the chief data officer of SunGard at one point. I was the CEO of a company called Fame Information Services way back in the day, and I've had lots of background work with some of the major data vendors in the space. Looking forward to the panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thank you all. So let's get started, and let's get started with an audience poll. The question is, what are the challenges of unstructured data at your organization? You can tick as many boxes as you like. And while you do that, let me come to Mark to set the scene and talk a little bit about how much unstructured data there is out there, how this compares to structured data, and how much of that data is actually being tapped and used.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Some really great questions to start with. But just before, I'd like to just set the scene a little bit more and talk a little bit about the difference between structured and unstructured, because I think it's important to have that context for the rest of the discussion. There's really two large categories of content, right? There's structured and unstructured. And structured data is the bigger problem. It's the harder challenge. It's very heterogeneous in nature, both in terms of content and in terms of the form in which it's represented. There's often a lack of structure both within and across that content, and there's little or no explicit relationships to make use of when we're trying to understand what it represents. There's also an absence or lack of metadata associated with that content, so we don't have a lot of context all of the time. And often we see that there's very little or formal governance being put in place on that content, which can cause real problems downstream. So in terms of how much, well, from our own findings, working with a wide variety of industries and client types, and also looking at recent reports from analysts and research organizations, we're seeing that unstructured data can take up as much as 80 to 90% of a business's data real estate. So it really is the dominant type of content within an organization. And in terms of what that looks like globally, the global volume of unstructured data currently is around about 50 zettabytes. And, I had to look up what a zettabyte was the other day because I was still stuck in petabytes. But it's expected to grow to about 175 zettabytes in the next 4 to 5 years. And that's quite an exponential growth. And just to put that into context, 175 zettabytes is actually 175 billion terabytes. So that's a significant amounts of content. And, some of our own clients, they're already in the petabyte range. They're already in the billions of files range. So, it's a problem that's only going to grow and get more complicated as we move forward. And so when you take a step back and you think about the places where unstructured content is stored, it's not really surprising that, it's 80 to 90%. We find unstructured content on file shares, in email, in cloud storage, in repositories like SharePoint. And more recently, during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of unstructured data being managed in collaboration tools like Microsoft Teams, and even in communication channels like Slack. And a lot of content is now being stored on local machines, so it's really hidden from the organization. And the final question you brought up there, Sarah, well, how much of that 80 to 90% of the real estate is actually being used? And if you think about it, a lot of unstructured data is quite ephemeral in nature. It has a short window of use. And it largely falls into 4 primary buckets. We've got content that's not really business material, non-business related. And we call that in the industry ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial content. There's highly likely to be a high level of duplication. And often content is used to create a finished product. So things like drafts of documents, review copies, etc. Or we create convenience copies like zip files to support distribution of content, and we leave those zip files around. They're maintained in the organization. And about 40 to 50% of all unstructured data falls into those categories of slightly ephemeral data. So in terms of the remainder, we see about 30% of that content that hasn't even been accessed or modified in the past 5 years. And that could be content that's out of retention policy. So there's no obligation for an organization to maintain that. So, getting those insights in the content can actually help you understand how much of that unstructured data you really should be maintaining and protecting going forwards.
Thank you. Dan, do those figures and numbers ring true with you?
Yes, I mean, 80 or 90% is certainly worldwide unstructured data. I mean, it's the kind of typical 80-20 rule, of course. And certainly in my experience working with our clients, that kind of resonates a little bit as well. If I look at some of our largest implementations of data which we're managing, the really large systems tend to be unstructured data where we're trying to make sense of the complexity of the contracts, the instant messages, the emails, the PDF documents, the policies, or whatever those that unstructured content is that needs to be stored and understood. So absolutely, typically price data or order data or those kind of customer data, they tend to be quite small by comparison. And I agree with Mark. Much of that stuff much of that data today is in file systems on people's hard disks and not really used or leveraged. Of course, the challenge is what's in there and is it useful or not, and how do we deal with that data? Those are kind of crucial things. So of that data, how much is actually valuable, and how can we get more value from that data, which is what we're seeing lots of our clients looking at now. We've got loads of data, but actually, does it provide any insight or value to us, and what is the path which they can go on to get more value from that data? Of course, it's we have general search engine capabilities which will allow us to have access to some of that data, but how do you get real value from that data? How do you understand the semantics of that unstructured content? How do you extract value from that, extract entities and data from it so it can be leveraged and used to drive applications and insights which can add value to our business? So yeah, I hear exactly what Mark's saying, and I think it is a large problem which we're not totally tapping into right now.
Okay, well, we'll look at some of the potential solutions a little bit later on, but please can we see the poll results? Thank you. Okay, we didn't miss out on this. And Mark, would you like to comment on those results?
Yeah, it's not surprising, really. Number one there, huge growing volumes of data. Yes, we all realize that's a problem, and it's not going away, right? It's only going to increase more and more as we go away. What surprises me a little bit is the lowest one there, understanding the data, and I think Dan highlighted some key points there that, data has value, right? And before you can take advantage of that value, you have to know what it is. You have to know where that value is. So I'm a little surprised that that's down at the bottom there.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, thank you. And let's bring Joe in here to talk about the regulatory and business risks associated with unstructured data. And clearly there is an awful lot of it.
Yes, certainly. Well, there's a few things I want to talk to here, and not all of them are obvious. So firstly, when you're considering unstructured data, you start with, I would think, known unknowns. So there's a lot of data you have, it's there, but you don't quite know what it is you're dealing with. And then there's, of course, unknown unknowns. If you actually tackle that unstructured data, things will come out of the woodwork. Now, with unstructured data, there's a concept I want to talk about in privacy, particularly called increased accessibility, and that is actually a privacy violation. So what does that mean with respect to unstructured data? Well, that's when you index the unstructured data and things suddenly come to light. So you suddenly make this data, which was, you could call it maybe benign or obscure, you suddenly make it accessible. And this has problems internally and externally. So I've first-hand experience of this. I was rolling out SharePoint at a marketing agency to replace their file shares, and we had this wonderful initiative where we said to them, look, we're going to index all your file shares, so you're not going to lose any of the value of that data. And these file shares were probably at least 10 years old. So I was training their teams on how to use SharePoint, and I said, everything's indexed now, so go and search for something, search for your name. So one of the women in the group searched for her name, and the first result was a copy of her passport, and the second result was a copy of her credit card, I think her company credit card, which were completely and totally accessible to everyone in the business, and they always had been, just no one could find them. So one of the risks is that we suddenly make all this stuff that no one could find visible. And it doesn't just have to be yourself making that data accessible. If, for example, you experience an incident and someone external, a threat actor, finds that data, and just throws it up on the internet, it won't take long for the search engines to find it and make all of that data searchable and findable as well. Now, in terms of regulatory risks, if you have a big ton or big section of unstructured data, you're effectively owning ungoverned data. And if that forms part of your records of processing activities or your obligations in privacy, they will be forever incomplete. And an auditing team that visits you, when they ask you about that data, you can't really say to them, well, we haven't done that bit yet, if you're trying to prove that you're compliant. And you're also increasing the threats to yourselves if you do, as I say, suffer an incident, particularly if you're storing unstructured data beyond how long it should be retained. There's a principle in privacy by design called data minimization, which just helps protect the business. But if you maintain that data for longer than you need to, even if you don't quite know what it is, you're presenting more of a risk to the business. Like a similar example to this is a case study from some of the studying I did for one of the privacy exams around Ashley Madison, which is a website for people who play away fixtures, is probably the way we could best describe that. And they retained a load of data for former members that was unnecessary for them to keep after they left. There was a breach and all these people were exposed. It was made public, and there was sadly some tragic consequences of that. But partly that was down to them keeping data that they didn't need. So if you have unstructured data if you can figure out whether it's necessary to keep or not, you can remove it. You automatically reduce the risk you're presenting to the organization in terms of privacy violations. So a few things to consider, but don't underestimate this increased accessibility, because once it's searched and indexed, it's findable is what I would say.
Okay, Dale, what would you add to that?
A few things here and there. I think, just coming back to some of the definitions again, and not to be too academic about this, but I think, we've already talked about unstructured data in a variety of different ways, and it can mean very, very different things. I mean, there are, on the one hand, firms extracting data from documents using things like NLP, that's, untapped data that's been sitting in a database for a long time. It can mean graphics or images. It can mean even just data that doesn't fit neatly into a normalized data model, or it doesn't fit into a tidy ontology or mapping. And it's one thing to extract data from an SEC document, which companies are doing, and you're kind of using sophisticated NLP and backdrop with people doing the work. But it's another thing completely to look at highly kind of productized data that, for example, might be supply chain data into an ESG analysis and mapping ESG data. That Joe talks about, indexing the data, and there's a giant debate about who owns the ontology and the ESG side of the world today, because it's kind of a very topical thread for every company to be, investment wise or banking wise, to be looking at how do they manage the information flow and supply chain data in that world. So I think, one of the things that this has kind of turned into is I've probably talked to 10 companies in the last month that are all broadening their definition of data management to look at the overall data operations cycle, from kind of soup to nuts. So what does it mean from, things we've talked about before, we've all used the term data operations, but now quality, structure, mapping, the PII stuff that Joe referred to, this is all part of a data operations superstructure that's, some of the bigger companies are rising to that occasion to service those things. So, I think unstructured data used to be, in some ways kind of like a side hustle, specialists would kind of go off and do this. And now it's mainstream. This is the kind of thing that always pops up in panels like this. What's become mainstream versus the kind of side piece. I think that, things I'm seeing, I guess, from a business risk perspective, these are pretty high level pieces, and, happy to drill into them or whatever, but the threads, there's quality. I mean, what's the definition of quality? I mean, again, we could have a whole seminar on that right off the bat, but, what's that, when you talk about unstructured data, what is the definition of the quality? And then there's an accuracy play. We've talked about the mapping play, which I think, Joe and others will talk about indexing. And this is huge. I mean, this is, Refinitiv built giant Herm ID things down to the atomic level. S&P bought Kensho so they could use AI to kind of knowledge graphs to attack things that weren't mapped before, et cetera, et cetera. There's all the, broadly speaking, ownership issues. When you're aggregating data, masking data, PII, legal, related issues and privacy. You go to a board at even a big institution now, and they're saying, well, should we enable our data through differential privacy? And they've researched it, and they have data science teams that are looking at those kinds of technologies. So I think it's there's reputational risk of letting data go out that shouldn't go out, and I think there's a lot of attention being given at the very top levels of organizations to think about this. I'd say tech is, what technology is being used. I mean, everybody's got machine learning on the tip of their tongue. Knowledge graphs are seemingly yesterday's news in some way, but some of the bigger, NLP shops who are doing this as a service bureau have significant human intervention. They'll ship, outlier, unstructured data searching that can't be solved with AI or machine learning to some kind of offshore group that are trained and specially set up to do those kinds of things. So I think the definition of the workflow and the technology used is very, very important in the space. So I guess I'm seeing it used in core analysis, decision making. Private equity companies are hiring specialists, investment analysis, not just the quant world, but the kind of mainstream discretionary and long only funds are all have teams of people, data science people that are looking at this. And they're all facing those kind of 4 or 5 challenges.
Okay, that's great. Let's move on and talk a little bit with you, Joe, if you may, about the need to integrate unstructured and structured data and how to do this. Obviously, there's a great difference here.
Yes, certainly. The pressing need from my perspective, and again, because of the industry, I mean, always I default to privacy, but comes from responding to data subject access requests. So that's an obligation, certainly in Europe. And when you have, whether the data is structured or unstructured, it's irrelevant to the data subject, it's their right to have it. And you can't turn around and sort of say to them, well, we've done this much, but the emails that concern you, we can't present that to you because that isn't currently structured. So you're faced with either not responding to the data subject access request adequately, which is a regulatory violation, or tasking someone or a group of people to sift through the data for an undetermined period of time and see what they can find. And even if they do find some things, they won't be able to say with any certainty that they found everything. So you're not going to be compliant in responding to your data subject access request. Now, considering how you can structure the data that's unstructured or integrated, there's a few options. And the first one I just alluded to just now is that you just set a team on it and then let them crack on, which is both time consuming and laborious, and I think undesirable as a task. And they won't thank you, but it is somewhat achievable. Secondly, you can use a tool to do this, a data discovery tool. So you can point that at the data and see what it comes up with. And we have a tool to do this within OneTrust. And this is useful because it does most of the heavy lifting. And I guess the outliers, then the team can refine that as we spoke to. Or we can also do what I'm kind of keen on is just deleting things. So if you can determine that the data you have has gone beyond its retention period, you could potentially delete it all. Now, in the industry privacy, there's a sort of inherent and almost irrational fear of deleting anything that I've seen. But if there's no genuine reason to keep it, you can delete it and reduce your risk. At the start of GDPR, the Wetherspoons pub chain in the UK deleted their entire customer database because they thought that was the most efficient way to be compliant. And I think they started again. But it's not something you should rule out if you can, I would say. So those are the approaches I would take. But the need is because you need to be able to demonstrate to a regulatory body that you have that data under some sort of governance and respond to subject access requests.
Okay, thank you. And David, bringing you in here and as a practitioner, how do you look at that, bringing the two types of data together?
Lots of good points being brought up across this conversation. And Joe, you just mentioned, as an option deleting data. And when I think about that, as a data and analytics person, I understand both sides of the coin because I've also sit on the compliance and risk side deleting data to mitigate risk, but deleting data loses the opportunity for historical trend analysis and other things that can drive analytics. So how do you weigh the use of data versus the risk of data, particularly as we continue to uncover structured and unstructured data and put all of that together? And then Mark opened talking about petabytes. We, and within our organization, have over 20 petabytes on our platform. So that means data that I would label as, at least more on the structured side. I can't say all of that sits on the structured side, but leaves a huge open question mark on how much unstructured data have we not tapped into within our organization, where we are, like others are mentioning here, reaching out and indexing data, looking at data, in some cases to uncover opportunity, and in other cases, potentially uncovering risk because of the amount of data that may be out there in general. And this all makes me recollect, I've been in the industry for a while, and in some of my opening days of working in the financial services industry, the amount of paper that we sent to paper storage, Iron Mountain, other, and that being a whole industry, that is a whole boxes and boxes, mounds and mounds of paper that needing digitized over time, or to look at what value might be in there and how can that enable what we're looking at today, and trying to ascertain where is their value versus where is that risk, as we keep talking about. And then Dale talked about data operations superstructures, right? So that is something that is key to me. My whole goal within my organization is to streamline data ingestion, operational structures to drive data and analytics across the organization. How do we find the value in the data, structured and unstructured, land it, organize it, indexing is a lot of the words that we're using here, et cetera, to make sense out of that data. And that is a huge piece of where we need to go forward when we think about the integration of unstructured and structured data. How do we leverage the metadata or components, natural language processing, et cetera, to assess our unstructured data and to make sense out of the value add that it might be able to provide, which will help in that decision process of risk versus use, but then also help us figure out how to increase accessibility within commercial tools, because we can catalog or we can identify unstructured data. Maybe we can make it semi-structured, or enhance the components that way, or at least make it findable, accessible to drive the opportunity respective to all of that. And within all of this, as I think forward, there's a whole discord between keeping up with the evolving structured data that is there on a daily basis. How do we make sense out of that? While how much time do we spend on assessing unstructured data to go back and look for that historical capability or commercialability, adding assets to that data, and being able just to naturally manage that paradigm between those two different perspectives. And then last thing I'll say is, we are all unstructured data providers in both our work and our personal lives. And I think we have to be very, very cognizant of, in both arenas, everything that we touch and create, how that might turn into structured or semi-structured data in the future, and how it can become leverageable. I think of all of the pictures that we put out in our phones on a regular basis, and as the technology keeps growing there, the ability now to look on your phone and your phone to assess, oh, that looks like a dog. You can categorize your pictures by a dog now. Well, you can do that. So can wherever all your pictures are being stored. Privacy rights aside for a moment, all of that stuff becomes hugely accessible for lots of different reasons. And we just need to be very cognizant as data creators, unstructured and structured, what the potential outcome of that can be.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to you, Mark, and obviously, we've talked quite a bit about GDPR and privacy. Do you see unstructured data governed and regulated by any other regulations, and how will that be going forward, do you think?
Oh gosh, what a great question. We could spend the whole day talking about regulation.
Yeah.
I think the short answer is I think all regulations have some impact on data, right? There's many industries to date that have historically had regulations for many, many years, looking at financial services, pharmaceutical industries, utility companies, all all industry-specific regulations that have really forced organizations to think about their data, whether it's unstructured or structured or semi-structured, from a governance perspective, from an information protection perspective, they're all forcing organizations to be able to deliver information in a timely and accurate manner, right, in support of those regulations. I do want just to expand a little bit, though, on what Joseph and David mentioned around privacy regulations, because I do see that as the new elephant in the room. Privacy regulations certainly an evolving and complex landscape, and it really is, cross-disciplinary, right? It's not just focused within one particular business vertical, and it's really forcing organizations to think more broadly about how they protect and secure sensitive and privacy related information in their organization across multiple sources, across multiple types of content. It was GDPR from Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, that really got everyone's attention, because it included clauses like what Joe mentioned around data subject access requests, the ability for an individual to put in a request to any business for information that they are maintaining about them, and also have the ability to put in a destruction request for that. So to say to that organization, I know you're keeping this information about me, but I'd like you to destroy it, please. And there are significant fines associated with violation of that regulation. In some cases, I think the maximum fines are up to 4% of gross revenue of an organization. And we've seen large companies already being faced with tens, in some cases, hundreds of $millions of fines. The situation in the US is a little bit more challenging because there is no national regulation on privacy. We're seeing every state across the US start to develop their own in absence of that mandate. And so that's forcing organizations to look at multiple regulations across that landscape. I think my own opinion is that may change going forward. I think a federal requirement may be on the horizon. There's certainly a lot of push for that inside of US legislation. But, having said that, this is an evolving landscape. I think we're going to see updates to the more broader regulations like GDPR that are forcing organizations to rethink their approach. So to wrap it all up, regulations touch all aspects of data. And, I think the focus right now is more on privacy and security. And I think that's going to filter out across every industry.
Okay. Supplementing what Marcus just said, and let's wrap up this section on regulation and privacy with this question. And David, what can firms do to ensure their unstructured data does meet compliance requirements? Chuck it all out, like Joe said.
Yeah, absolutely. And just tapping into the compliance component for a moment and what regulation and regulatory can look like. There's reactive and there's proactive there. And whereas there compliance and regulatory being pushed on financial services and organizations to leverage that data that, in some cases can produce risk. But then from a proactive perspective, how can we leverage data and drive toward achieving compliance by being able to assess unstructured and structured data to be able to make sure we're following various regulations as that might be. And you can think about in the trading world, all of the compliance requirements around recorded phone calls and how chats are recorded, et cetera, and the ability to leverage natural language processing to extract out of that, the necessary things that are required for risk mitigation and for other reasons. So even though that doesn't sound proactive, because it's still very much how do you maintain that you're within a regulatory space and regulatory compliance, but at least in that case, you're using the data in your favor to assure that you're in alignment versus the data exposing you reactively to things you may not be aware of. I think the point earlier was knowing the unknown, or at least being aware of the unknown, and then the scarier part is maybe the unknown of the unknown, and where is that risk inherently. But then also, comes out of that managing what are your requirements, storage versus choice. And in the financial services regulatory space, you have to maintain certain data for a certain period of time by requirement. but then making that choice, as we talked about multiple times, where do you draw the line between there's value in this data versus risk in the data beyond the period of time that you're mandated to keep it. But I also think, with all the tooling and technology we're talking about here, with the ability to index and categorize data in a much more automated fashion, that allows us to make those assessments of the data to value, risk, or commerciability or other data and analytics trending capabilities of that data much more quickly, as we can start to categorize and understand what that data looks like, and what the risks may ultimately end up causing us, and so we can make that evaluation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to some of the things you've talked about in a while, but first I'd like us to take a couple of audience questions, if we may. We talked about risk association with unstructured data. How can we mitigate this? Who'd like to answer that one?
I don't mind jumping in.
Yeah, please, David.
Into a number of things we talked about with the indexing and classification, and taps into what I was just talking about. The more that we can at least start to categorize or make sense out of unstructured data, the more that we're able to assess the value versus the risk of it and make key decisions in advance of others making those decisions on our behalf, and staying ahead of it that way.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. Coming to you, Dan, if I may, we have this question. We are working with unstructured data in compliance, but the volumes are so high, it takes too much time and effort. How best can we capture just the data we need out of all those petabytes? It doesn't say that.
I agree with what David said. I mean, where you have large quantities of data, you need to start classifying it and sorting it, so making it discoverable so you can understand the content of it, and then proceed further. Well, what is it that you do need to from this data, or what would you like? So the notion of entity extraction and NLP comes to the forefront there. We can start extracting those values and providing some structure around them. And that then effectively allows you to drive some structured type query capability on this unstructured content. And that's really the very kind of lowest level of you starting to extract some more value from your data. If you just have hundreds of terabytes of it and then just kind of, I don't know where to start, you actually need to think, well, what is in here? Let me start some discovery and some classification. I think that's the ideal starting point.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on and run another audience poll question. This time the question is, which of these technologies is important to your organization's management of unstructured data? And I suspect there may be some that aren't on this list, but while you select those that you feel are important, let me come back to you, Dan, to talk about the types of RegTech tools, solutions and services that are useful here.
Yeah, so I mean, many of our clients, we see they have a large quantities of unstructured content and structured content, which they need to manage in the context of their regulatory landscape, whether that's MiFID or GDPR. In the GDPR landscape, we've already touched on this, but how can we identify and discover sensitive information within documents or within records? How can we then protect those and ensure that they are have the appropriate access controls to them, and make sure that only the right people have access to those things? So that's one of the crucial things which we see from that perspective. And then we look at kind of the structured landscape, maybe something like MiFID, where we're looking at trades and orders and stuff, and how do we collate those type of things. Again, it all comes back to, whether it's structured or unstructured, it comes back to down to data management and the data management platform. And those two types of data, we kind of have different approaches to them. For the unstructured conversation, as we've said, we need the base level. We want to consolidate that into a single environment, the unstructured content which we want to look at. We want to make it in the first instance searchable and discoverable, because we want and then allow access to our parties through the appropriate access controls. That's kind of a base level starting point. Once we have that, then let's start discovery. What connections can we see behind those, between the different entities which we're finding within that content? So then there's kind of this really this process of classifying documents, so we know what they are, or classifying even the contents of those documents or portions of those documents. We want to then look at how we can enrich and mark up and annotate key aspects of that. So there might be counterparty information, there might be specific price information, for example, or granular data within there, which is of interest for us. So enrich those, discover those, extract those entities and mark them up as metadata. And once we've got that, we can start making sense of it, and then we can start getting some value from it. And that means labeling those structures and understanding that data, using that to drive analytics within our organization, of course. We want to drive dashboards so we can understand how that data is moving, evolving, and changing. And of course, the prize, which we all touch on, of course, is how can we use that data in the future to drive predictive models and give us deep insights from our data. So all, I guess in a nutshell, it all comes back to data management, and data management of unstructured data is, I guess, we're very good at managing data that is structured. We've got database management systems for structured data we've had for donkey's years. But how can we bring that same rigor to unstructured data? And of course, a single information space where we can manage that structured data and that unstructured data in that single space to start grabbing some real value from it.
Okay, fine. Let's follow up, please, with a quick comment from some of your colleagues on tools, text solutions. Joe, what would you say there?
Yeah, no doubt that was a great description. So again, on the privacy side, we have this concept of know your data, know your laws. So whether you find your data with a person or with a discovery tool like we have, you then need to understand what you need to do with that data. So understand the laws that apply to it. And there are artificial intelligence solutions in the market, and we have one, of course, which will apply the data that you found to the laws that apply to it and tell you what to do and give you some guidance. So those are all things to consider. But from the past three remarks, I think everyone needs to be aware of that this is going to take some work. Whether you use a tool or a vendor or you do it as an in-house project, you're not going to get from risk-prone unstructured data to governed data without some sort of investment of time and energy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Dale, coming to you there. In terms of tech solutions and so on, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I guess I'd put things into 4 or 5 different categories, and just really, really quickly, I think, we've talked about a lot of these, but just to back it up a little bit, I think there's a lot of discussion around, mapping and lineage tools, and there's firms out there that provide those. There's some deep product mapping kind of vendors. I mentioned earlier what some of them have done. There's some significant NLP machine learning players that are extracting all kinds of valuable information, and then specialist firms as well, firms that are kind of working on Wall Street, working on other places. There's some really interesting, I think we probably danced around it. Maybe the vendors on the call here have some of this capability, but the kind of what I'll call masking, obfuscation tools, companies like Privitar, hopefully that doesn't ruffle anybody's feathers here, but I know they take giant data sets and they mine it for patterns versus seeing the underlying details of what's in the information. So I think that's pretty interesting stuff. And I think, we've talked about contextualizing and dashboards and know your data. They all fit into the same bucket. No point in just throwing a giant raw database at somebody without kind of providing some kind of capability that is contextualizing. So those would be the kind of solution. And I've got names of companies that do these kinds of things already, but I think that's those would be the rough boxes.
Okay, Mark, would you like to add any final comments on tools and services, etc.?
Yeah, I think Joe, Dan, and Dale have encapsulated it really well, and it resonates certainly with my own thoughts. But I think one thing to add is that there's no silver bullet out there. There's no one tool that can do everything. And also, technology is the enabler. It really, a complete solution requires a combination of technology, people, process, and policy. And without any of those kind of legs of the stool, you don't have a solution. And then finally, for me, the biggest area is tools that can help you understand what you don't know you have. And that's really the start point for any journey. And it's certainly something we advocate with our clients.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And let's look at those poll results and see where we are in terms of techs. Yep, cloud's right up there, automation's up there, AI, machine learning, visualization, and other things. Joe, would you like to make a quick comment on that?
Oh, certainly. I think more cloud is to be expected. I'm surprised artificial intelligence wasn't higher up the order. Actually, that's been a huge buzz around the industry lately, as if it's going to be a solution to well, everything. It'll be a solution to some things, not everything, of course. But yeah, I would have thought that might have positioned a bit higher.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you to our audience for voting there. And let me actually, no, let's just run our final poll of the day. And while we do that, the question is about using unstructured data to drive business value beyond compliance. So whilst you answer that question, let me come to you, David. So with compliance in place, financial firms can gain value from unstructured data, and sort of how do they do this, and what resources do they need?
Well, a comment that Dan made a little bit ago about, he used the word data management. I'm going to tack onto that data strategy, leveraging all of that. And that's a key fundamental process in being able to do a lot of things that we've talked about to also, as I mentioned earlier, just to start to unlock the greater value in the data that you have, and to be able to better assess the risk versus value. With that, comes with, we understand what is the intended use of the data. And I'm going to flip for a moment from thinking about this from a compliance and regulatory perspective, and then into that gaining value. How do you now think about the data as an asset, and potentially the monetization of that data to drive commercial use cases and other things in the movement forward? And if I think about the increase in digital engagement and the opportunities that come with that in the unstructured data space, to better understand consumer behavior, to better understand, I work on the B2B side of things. So what's the behavior of corporation to corporation type engagement? What data sets are they going after? What data sets are they looking for, et cetera? So, something that's I think something on the B2B side that has been slower in the making than on the consumer side is overarching digital engagement, and the ability then to leverage digital engagement to drive and all of the data that comes with that opportunity, and looking for that. So this disruptive period we've been in for the last almost 2 years now has been beneficial in the sense of catapulting organizations into the arena that consumers have been in for quite some time, and making that the new engagement model. But again, with that comes tons of opportunity. I think somebody mentioned ESG early on in this conversation, and ESG is a particular interesting topic for us. We assess behavior across ESG topics to understand where the investor issues or interests are, so that we can better gauge, from that perspective. But we're able to do that through digital engagement. We can't do that, with some of the more traditional means as effective. But you are also still using, to a certain degree, an assessment of both unstructured and structured data to get to those social interests and those social behaviors. As we assess that, that comes with voice, that comes with email. But the more and more that we have the digital engagement that is more embedded in our architecture and our tools, and not peripheral like phones and emails, et cetera, the more that it helps push forward for identifying data as an asset.
Okay, thank you. Dan, what would you say there in terms of driving value out of unstructured data?
So I think just kind of picking up on the resources side, which we haven't really touched on, I don't think, yet in this conversation.
Thank you.
I've talked about things like classification and enrichment of data, which of course is crucial, understanding sensitive parts of that data and being able to pick out PII and secure that. But what about actually understanding the semantics of this unstructured content, and how can we across industry start understanding the data a little bit more in more detail? I think as an industry, the information technology industry has built tools which it makes it all too easy for you to label data however you wish. And of course, when it comes to data integration, that's the biggest crux. If all your data is labeled differently or categorized differently, then being able to pull it together with any sensible meaning has always been a big struggle. So that's where things like ontologies come along. So those predefined rules which allow us predefined terms, and so we can show how they relate to one another. How can we layer those ontologies onto our unstructured content, leverage those with things like NLP, so we can understand the content and the concept specifically, So getting value from that data, being able to not just query keywords and phrases, but let's query concepts. So this idea that we see quite a lot with our clients is this notion of query expansion, where we search a term, but we leverage an ontology to expand that to encompass all kinds of different data as well. Of course, there's work that's already being done within financial services, things like like FIBO, the Financial Services Industry Business Ontology. We have clients helping them to manage and get value from that unstructured content by knowing what they're talking about and knowing and searching for concepts and those kind of things. So I think that notion of ontologies, that notion of semantics and understanding that data is the next step forward. And once you've done that, then making it accessible to third parties through interfaces which kind of speed business processes, and that's what we've been trying to help our clients do and achieve.
Okay, thank you. Let's see how our audience is getting on this. So can we see the poll results, please? Okay, fairly mixed. Dan, what would you like to say about that?
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, that's kind of, typical with what we see. I mean, you're not going to get much value out of your unstructured content if it's sitting on a file system or someone's hard disk. If you've got a set of contracts or policy documents or profiles, then actually you need to start trying to make use of those and understand them and extract the content out of them. You can't run a query very successfully on your data if it's sitting on your file system, and that's kind of really the base level. You need to understand your unstructured data to get value from it.
Okay, fine. So thank you indeed for voting. Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, so must try harder, I think, is what we should say.
Okay, fine. And thank you to our audience for voting on that question. And indeed, coming back to you again, Dan, can you explain quickly just a couple of business use cases of unstructured data?
Yeah, so I've got one which kind of springs to mind, which kind of resonates with a lot of the topics which we've been discussing here. One of our clients has built an onboarding and KYC, Know Your Customer platform using our technology, of course. And that is a combination of structured data, so legal entity identifier type information, unstructured content, things like ISDA contract documents, identification documents, things like passports, for examples, and driving licenses, and other supporting content and correspondence which go with those kind of processes. And so they leverage our platform to ingest all of that vastly different content and make it discoverable. They classify those documents internally so they can make each one much more discoverable and much more readily accessible. They even go down into some of their contracts and classify individual clauses within their contracts so they know what they're searching in. They can help them identify toxic clauses within contracts, for example, and a whole bunch of other interesting things like that. And once they've extracted facts along those, they use NLP type technology, and they also use entity extraction, ontology-driven entity extraction technology, which allows them to pull out interesting things out of their content. It allows them then to drive, faceted search style applications to help speed this process, as well as laying on structured queries to drive analytical dashboards and business intelligence tools off this single repository. So for them, it's a great use case of classifying documents, using ontologies, leveraging the power of some of these techniques we've been talking about with regards to managing unstructured content, but matching it up with the structured content to drive some real business insight. And so it kind of touches on all points I think we've talked about today. So that was the key use case I had to share.
Okay, thank you. Mark, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, very quick. I'll give you an example of where moving from a position of not knowing what you have to unlocking the real value of that content can have significant advantage to an organization. So one of our clients is in the oil and gas distribution industry, and that industry has gone through a lot of acquisitions and mergers over the last several years. And what comes with an acquisition is a ton of data, and not knowing what that data is, what do you do with it, and what's the value of it, and should you retain it? So particular interesting aspect of one of the acquisitions, the client discovered through the use of file analysis that within the data that they acquired, there were 20,000 zip files that themselves contained over 2 million files, a real unknown quantity. So having gone through then a classification and an entity extraction exercise, analyzing that content, they determined that only 50,000 of those files had real value to the business, and therefore they could go through a really efficient data minimization exercise and then unlock the potential of that content throughout the business.
Big task, both of those big tasks. Very interesting. Thank you both. Okay, we come to the final talking point of our conversation today, and I'd like to ask all our experts to provide some guidance for practitioners who are working on unstructured data. So Dale, could I come to you first, please?
Sure. I guess just, in terms of three quick pieces of advice, I would say contextualizing the data and understanding the data, which we talked about a lot. That's a key piece, whether it's through dashboards, queries, data science. One. Number two is on the privacy side, which is a deep well of discussion. And I know we talked about this from a regulatory perspective, but a lot of the clients I've been talking to have board representation in terms of whether they provide the data or don't provide the data. And they have legal teams that look at how they offer up the data to third parties, monetizing it, aggregated, whether it's masked, whether there's a risk assessment, whether there's a legal opinion, whether there's an attestation. So that privacy well is a deep one. So I would dig into that, make sure that you've got your ducks lined up. And then, anything that falls under the so-called kind of what I'm just saying, quality metrics, but it includes mapping. We talked about ontologies, those types of things. And I'd piggyback whatever is done to the extent that you can. I mean, if it's not done, then obviously you're in virgin territory. And I would say there's some urgency to this. Everybody else has probably seen this. There's an article that came out just in the last few days, but Accenture talking about, corporate clients monetizing their IoT data in a $3.6 trillion value model by the year 2030. This is a big thing. So, if anybody thinks that managing this kind of information and monetizing it and keeping track of it is a small thing, think again. This is going to be a huge thing.
Okay. David, some guidance from you, please.
Reinforcing something that Dale said, just in different language, investing time and resources in understanding your data to reduce the unknown risk and value. So unlocking value, reducing the unknown risk. But then also, as you're assessing your data, do it unconditionally and unbiased, and thinking about the data from all perspectives and all angles when looking again for that unlocking value and mitigating risk. And then once the decision is made based on the use case, communicate the value of the action. Because quite often in data organizations, it's hard to share the larger input to the organization you're adding and how it's affecting and improving the bottom line. So looking for clear, articulate use cases on mitigating risk and creating efficiencies and creating a commercial opportunity. And then back to the delete. I would say remove where risk is greater than perceived value, and make sure that you do that considerately and thoughtfully.
Thank you. Joe, a few words from you.
Yeah, certainly. I'd like to talk to this concept is relatively new of data intelligence. And the best way I find of thinking about this is considering data unintelligence, which is this unstructured data you have that you're getting no value out of, that's presenting risk to the business. You need to try and determine how you're going to use that data to help you make better and good decisions and make it intelligent effectively. So that would be a good place, I think, to start, even perhaps before you dive into data discovery and so on. You must have at least some idea of what's there. How can that add value to the business and help us make better decisions? And then look at how to maybe start to structure that and make it work for us.
Okay, thank you. Mark, coming to you.
Yeah, I think it resonates what Joseph said there. Let's start simple. Let's start by building out a data map, data inventory, get a sense for what you have, because you can't protect or extract value from that until you get it, get a good understanding of what it is. Automate as much as you can, but be cognizant that there are human aspects to this. No technology is 100% foolproof or automated. So develop policies and procedures to supplement that technology implementation, and echoing what David said, clean up the data, get rid of what you don't need to keep. because you're removing the risk and you're driving down the cost.
Fab. And some last words from you, please, Dan.
So I get some great points there. So I guess from my perspective, I think we're looking at, in the first instance, looking to collate that information to allow it to be searchable and discoverable. And I think we've all touched on that. We need to understand our data. I think it was Joe that said that once we've got in a place where we can search it, touch it, feel it, and get a sense of it, then we kind of know which way we're pointing. Once we've done that, then there's that second iteration, and that effectively is the curation, enrichment, and classification of data, of that unstructured content. You know, we discussed about processing that data with ontologies, be able to mark them up and annotate them, so we can actually leverage them in some kind of useful way. And once we've got that base level of data, which we know something about, it's got metadata, it's enriched, we've got reference data, it's linked together in interesting ways, so we can traverse across it. Then we want to democratize that data by making it accessible across our organizations, and being able to expose that data as APIs allows applications, teams within the business to leverage that data and deliver it in applications which add value. And we can, of course, leverage it, as we've touched on before, to drive predictive models in our machine learning capabilities, so we can drive real deep insights from that data, which otherwise would have just gone to waste.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise. Thank you too to OneTrust, ActiveNav and MarkLogic for sponsoring today's webinar. You've really packed it in, and I hope you've been able to take some value from it yourselves. Before we close up, just a few A-Team group items that may be of interest to you. We recently launched a new content service called ESG Insight. You can see that on your screens now with a link. It's a new channel for us, but it's full of regulatory information, data sourcing, data management, standards, risk, reporting, regulation, and so on. So please feel free to access that and keep following along the ESG story. Also, if you scroll down, you can download our ESG handbook from this year and our regulatory data handbook 2020-2021, but we'll have an updated version of that in just a few weeks, I feel sure. Alternatively, you can register for next week's RegTech Summit Virtual. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to David, Joe, Mark, Dan, and Dale. And thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.